Good day to everyone. My name is Lebohang Matibela. It is my pleasure to welcome you at the Northwest University's Joint Gender and Language Awareness Week in 2020. As part of the transformation agenda of the university, the NWU hosts annual awareness weeks to create opportunities for inclusive conversations to explore current issues concerning race, gender, and language. Due to COVID-19 situation, we are hosting an online awareness week in 2020 that focuses on gender and language, and it is my pleasure to welcome you in the NWU home and the homes of our presenters. We want to thank our presenters up front. They shared their expertise with us by making homemade videos for their studies, from their studies and from their living rooms. We appreciate their willingness to share their expertise with us under less than ideal circumstances, and we adore the authenticity of their views, underscored by the very personal touch of the handmade quality of the videos. The topics that our presenters tackled and that we will discuss are hard-hitting. Our aim in 2020 was to trouble our past and to reimagine our future. Our focus this year is the current state of gender-based violence and the ongoing complex conversations about multilingualism in South Africa. Some of the contributions are unsettling and very controversial. As a higher education institution, it is our duty to create opportunities where these difficult and sometimes painful conversations can take place in a safe space. The audience will be able to contribute to the conversation after the presentations. We encourage multilingual contributions. A translator would monitor the chat and the Q&A functions and assist with translations where necessary. I want to make a plea to members of the audience who are, you are also invited to assist with the translations if you are able to do so. In this way, we will be helping each other. We request that all comments and replies be respectful as is fitting of conversations at a higher education institution. The contributions would be via the chat and the Q&A functions and will be in writing. We request that comments are concise and relevant to the topic at hand. We look forward to the engagement of the audience after the presentations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, some technical issues. Once you are logged in, you will see a small green button on the right-hand side of your screen. You click on this, you will see the chat facility. We would love to hear your comments and would love for you to keep the momentum going by putting your comments in the chat. Should you have any questions related to any of our speakers or presentations, please put your questions in the Q&A. Some presenters will be present during the sessions and some not. You must remember we have guests from all over the world. Some would be sleeping in their countries because it would be midnight. If you have any questions to the presenters who could not join us, we will send your questions to them via email after the session. You will also be able to upvote someone else's question to move that question up to the top. The hosts and coordinators would keep an eye on the prominent questions and respond to them. In order to make use of all the awesome features that this visual platform has to offer, we recommend that you use your laptop. If you have logged on with your mobile phone or tablet, you may not experience all these features, but don't worry. There is time to log on with your laptop in addition to that. We will share our recordings after the event. For optimal viewing, we would like to suggest that you click on the full screen arrows, which is located in the top right-hand corner. This will expand your view. Should you experience a drop in your connectivity, again, don't panic. This does happen. Just simply refresh your browser and you will be automatically logged back in. Welcome to the NW's joint Gender and Language Awareness Week. Please sit back and enjoy the sessions with us.
Gender-based violence can be described as a form of violence on any individual based on his or her gender. This means both women and men can be victims of gender-based violence. However, it is commonly perpetrated by men against women, as it has been shown from various media reports as well as cases reported in our courts. It can be referred to as a social ill because it is a problem across the globe, and it is some kind of a phenomenon deeply rooted in gender inequality, and it continues as one of the most notable human rights violations, and it happens in every nation, even the most developed societies. The violence can occur in many forms. It can happen through the actual physical violence or threats thereof. It may even take the form of verbal, emotional, psychological, even economical abuse. In South Africa, certain legislations have been introduced specifically to address the scourge of gender-based violence. I can safely refer to the Domestic Violence Act as well as the Protection from Harassment Act. The Domestic Violence Act applies in instances where gender-based violence is perpetrated amongst family members or people who have a domestic relationship as defined in terms of the Domestic Violence Act. And on the other side, the Protection from Harassment Act will find application in instances where people are not related at all, meaning that even a stranger can be afforded protection in terms of the Protection from Harassment Act. These two legislations have defined a conduct which forms the basis of domestic violence or harassment in wider terms, so as to include any act which may result in psychological, emotional, or even physical harm to another person. Apart from these two legislation, the Sexual Offences Act has broadened the definition of rape or sexual assault, which are the most common forms of gender-based violence committed in our country. In terms of that act, rape can also be perpetrated against males. And rape is no longer limited to commission through certain bodily parts such as human genitals, but it can also be perpetrated through any part of the body, such as the tongue or even the fingers. Apart from the Sexual Offences Act, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which is commonly referred to as the minimum sentences legislation, has been introduced also as a means to curb the scourge of gender-based violence. In terms of this legislation, long-term imprisonment have been introduced in respect of gender-based violence-related kind of offenses. For instance, life imprisonment can be imposed in respect of a rape of any person under the age of 16, or even where the victim is an adult, but rape has been perpetrated more than once, even by one person, or in instances where it is perpetrated by two people in respect of the same victim. I will say that women and children have become the targets for COVID-19 related frustrations. This is apparent from the increased number of cases that are received in our courts on a daily basis, as well as in various courts across the country. In my district, there is a dedicated court which deals solely with gender-based violence-related matters. During the period of the lockdown, or at the beginning, after consultations with stakeholders and having received reports from the local COVID-19 Command Council, I resolved to serve in that court personally. I must say that since end of April up to the end of July, statistics have reflected a drastic increase in cases reported at that particular court. Previously, we received about 8 to 12 cases per day, but since the lockdown period, the new cases ranges from about 25 to 32 cases in a day. The strain of the lockdown caused by the loss of employment and consequently loss of income has turned even the decent and respectable people into abusers, as they took their frustrations on their partners, wives, and even the children. Sadly, the victims of gender-based violence, mostly being women and children, were compelled to stay in those abusive and unhealthy environments because the movements were restricted, or they had the option of living to less desirable circumstances, and by so doing risking contracting the deadly virus. I have observed in the dedicated court where I am currently serving that cases that were previously finalized and where orders were granted, that is protection orders were granted in terms of the Domestic Violence Act or the Protection from Harassment Act. Those cases came back on our roll as violations of the conditions of those orders. This is because the victims were confined in the same space as their abusers. Unfortunately, when it comes to hearings of gender-based violence cases, emotional can run very high, especially on the victims. So the court is required from time to time to take the necessary breaks to allow the victims to compose themselves, or to even allow them to receive the necessary professional assistance where necessary. Another strain that has come with the COVID-19 pandemic is that because we are required to comply with the regulations, not all the officials are required to be at work at the same time, and even if we are working, we are only expected to be at work for limited periods of time. But unfortunately, when it comes to gender-based violence related cases, the court has to proceed insofar as it is possible, insofar as the witnesses and all the other parties concerned can proceed. obvious gaps exist on the side of the stakeholders who are charged with the responsibility of ensuring compliance with the very same legislations. I can quote a few examples. Sometimes there is lack of resources to ensure compliance with the legal frameworks, and I have noted from the period that I have served at the dedicated court that the undue delay serving of the interim as well as final orders lead to prolonged duration of cases and the continued suffering of the victims. Some other factor which is attributed to the existing gaps is the lack of knowledge of those available legal frameworks or sheer ignorance of the law by the members of the public in general. Factors such as cultural beliefs as well as patriarchal practices, economic background, socialization processes as well as gender stereotypes are key drivers in widening the gaps that exist and also defeats the very purpose intended by those legislations. However, something can be done and can be done if people work together. I can emphasize that there is a need for more education as well as awareness campaigns just to make the public aware of what gender-based violence involves and how it can be avoided.
Now, gender-based violence is the general term used to capture violence that occurs as, in the first place, a result of the normative role expectations associated with gender, associated with the sex assigned to a person at birth. In the second place, as well as the unequal power relations between the genders within the context of a specific society. Thus, gender-based violence includes physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse or threats of such acts or abuse. Coercion, economic or educational deprivation, whether occurring in public or private life, in peacetime and during armed or other forms of conflict, and obviously may cause physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, or economic harm. So to summarize it, to explain gender-based violence to you, it includes physical, economic, sexual, and psychological abuse, as well as rape, sexual harassment, and trafficking of women for sex and sexual exploitation. Now, femicide, as part of gender-based violence, is the most extreme form of gender-based violence in South Africa. It is defined as the killing of a female person or perceived female person on the basis of gender identity, whether perpetrated or tolerated by the state or its agents and private sources. Intimate femicide refers to the killing of a female by an intimate partner, a current or a former husband or boyfriend, same-sex partner, or a rejected would-be lover. The Constitution of South Africa sets the framework for an effective legislative response to gender-based violence. Now, a number of policies and legislation are in place to respond to gender-based violence. I'm just going to mention about 6 of them, but there are a whole list of policies and legislation. In the first instance, the National Crime Prevention Strategy of 1996 establishes crimes of violence against women and children as a national priority. Then secondly, the Criminal Law Amendment Act 105 of 1997 establishes mandatory minimum sentences for certain rapes. In the third place, the Criminal Procedure Second Amendment Act 85 of 1997 allows for bail conditions to be tightened in cases of those charged with rape. In the fourth place, the Domestic Violence Act 116 of 1998 sets out to offer options to victims of abuse through identifying bodies and making provision for interim protection orders. In the fifth place, the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act 32 of 2007 codified and broadened the definition of rape and other sexual offences and introduced new offences that relate to gender-based violence, including using or exposing children to child pornography and pornography, both off and online. It provides also for the National Policy Framework on the Management of Sexual Offences Matters 2012. In the sixth place is the Maintenance Act 99 of 1998, obviously as mentioned, because failure to pay maintenance is a form of economic abuse. Now, this is my field of expertise. We have, apart from criminal prosecution in the Maintenance Act, various civil remedies constituted to ensure the payment of maintenance and child maintenance. Gender-based violence is an ill that has left no sector of society untouched. South Africa holds the shameful distinction of being one of the most unsafe places in the world to be a woman. We have amongst the highest rates of intimate partner violence, and recently released data show that rape and sexual violence have become hyper-endemic. South Africa are inundated daily by media and police reports of the horrific and senseless murder and rape and maiming of women and children in homes and communities. In addition, women, particularly black, poor, and rural women, bear the brunt of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, while carrying the responsibility of taking care of the emotional, physical, and financial needs of children. Economic abuse, whereby financial resources are controlled and withheld, has a significant impact on the lives of women and children, often leaving them with no choice but to remain in abusive relationships. Furthermore, when women leave abusive relationships, financial abuse often continues through withholding of child maintenance. The COVID-19 crisis and physical distancing measures have caused deep concerns about the impact on women in abusive relationships. Numerous articles in the South African media have pointed to the increased risk women in these relationships face under lockdown conditions. The fears that they are trapped inside with the abusers, unable to leave, escape, or reach out for help. It was the fear, but the opposite actually happened. There was a decline in gender-based violence matters reported. One explanation could be that the ban on alcohol sales has reduced the severity of domestic violence cases and the opportunity for rape. Sober partners may still be abusive and controlling, but are perhaps less likely to resort to extreme physical violence. Due to the impact of COVID-19 and lockdown restrictions, which impacted on the movability of people for the months of April and May 2020, we reflected a 48.7% decrease in the number of matters reported at sites. During hard lockdown in April 2020, movement was severely restricted, hence court performance disrupted. During Alert Level 4, May 2020, court performance improved. However, a 75%, it's about 288 less convictions, decline is noted in the number of convictions obtained compared to May 2019. In perspective, the same downward trend was noted in other priority cases such as murder and trio prosecutions. For murder, a decline of 79%, 235 less convictions, and for trio crimes, a decline of 90%. It appears from the analysis that a priority focus on gender-based violence cases is apparent. However, despite the COVID-19 constraints, additional concerted efforts are required to ensure improved prioritization of these cases. Hence, it is evident that close cooperation with stakeholders in the criminal justice value chain is critical to address the negative impact of this pandemic and to ensure constant improvement in the court performance of gender-based violence and femicide cases. In anticipation of an in-depth discussion at the provincial stakeholder fora, divisions are required to inform the meeting of the measures that they've put in place to ensure constant prioritization and improved service delivery of gender-based violence cases. During the course of 2018 and 19, South Africa has increasingly acknowledged the crisis of gender-based violence and its profound impact on the lives and well-being of survivors, children, families, communities, and society as a whole. There's an increasing recognition that this context demands a whole-of-society approach in understanding, responding, preventing, and ultimately eliminating gender-based violence and femicide. Furthermore, it is recognized that the role and duty of the state to fulfill its constitutional obligation is paramount. In response to mounting calls from women's groups, civil society and the public at large for urgent action to be taken to address this problem, on the 1st and the 2nd of November 2018, a presidential summit on gender-based violence and femicide was held, and it is regarded as a landmark summit in several aspects. This summit concluded with the signing of a declaration that government, business, labour and civil society would collaborate to conceptualise, drive and implement concrete measures to eradicate gender-based violence. Also, a strengthened emphasis to coherently and comprehensively respond to the social norms, inequalities and structural drivers that result in the high levels of gender-based violence and femicide the country is facing. And then lastly, a deeper understanding of the scale and nature of gender-based violence in the country while improving data systems to support effective implementation and understanding of the impact of the National Strategic Plan. Now, the National Prosecuting Authority and our Thuthuzela care centres also participated in campaigns focused inter alia on a couple of topics, which was the essence of gender-based violence and the early disclosure, reporting of sexual or physical abuse. The influence of drugs and alcohol at schools, child pornography and related cybercrime. So we as the National Prosecuting Authority are actively part of this campaign and the National Strategic Plan established as a result of this meeting on the 1st and the 2nd of November 2018.
The current pandemic has disrupted the normal functioning of populations around the world and continues to flourish indiscriminately. The most serious consequence of this, from my perspective, is the closing down of support services such as courts, police stations, and victim assistance services, even if these shutdowns were only for a day or two. Even though Corona threatens all of us, women and girls are unreasonably affected by this. The measures taken to protect us, including the lockdown, leave women and girls especially vulnerable to violence. Sexual and gender-based violence is an insidious consequence of this pandemic. It is said that disasters exacerbate pre-existing gender inequalities and power hierarchies. This was seen and extensively researched during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa from 2013 to 2015. Sexual and gender-based violence does not begin with disasters like COVID-19, but the chaos and instability they cause leave women and girls more vulnerable. According to the World Health Organization, 35% of women around the world have already experienced some form of sexual and gender-based violence in their lifetime. In some crisis settings, this number skyrockets to more than 70%. There also tends to be an uprising in teenage pregnancies in areas recovering from pandemics. Gender-based violence is any form of violence, including physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, threats, coercion, and financial or educational deprivation that is directed at an individual based on his or her biological sex or gender identity. Current legislation in South Africa includes the Domestic Violence Act and the Harassment Act, both of which provide a framework in terms of which a special form of interdict called a protection order may be obtained by victims. Violent crimes are prosecutable in South Africa and should, in most instances, lead to a prison sentence. Then we should also note the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act Amendment Bill, which was introduced in Parliament on the 19th of August 2020. This bill aims to amend the criminal law to extend the range of the offence of incest and to introduce a new offence of sexual intimidation. This act will further regulate the reporting duty of persons who are aware that sexual offences have been committed against children. The bill also aims to amend the Act by further regulating the inclusion of particulars of persons in the National Register for Sex Offenders, making provision for certain particulars of persons who have been convicted of sexual offences to be made publicly available. Then we also have the Victim Support Services Bill of 2020, which is currently open for comments from the public and which aims to provide a framework within which victims will receive support services from government institutions. It is hoped that this act in its final form will lead to greater cooperation between various departments in assisting and servicing victims of specifically violent crimes, and will lead to victims receiving timeous and proper assistance and the restoration of victim dignity. Lastly, the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill of 2020 and the Criminal and Related Matters Amendment Bill of 2020 will shortly be introduced, both of which aim to improve and regulate our current legal framework when dealing with gender-based violence. And our knee-jerk response is usually that government must do better. We need more laws. However, I believe that South Africa does have a strong legal framework for dealing with gender-based violence, which is largely assisted by our secular government policies, which excludes gender discrimination on religious and cultural grounds. I believe that we fail our people in two areas: education and enforcement. A global study on the implementation of the United Nations Security Resolution 1325 found that independent women's groups were the single most important factor in addressing violence against women and girls. In light of this, women and girls should be involved in the development and delivery of services. It is also very important that government should identify existing organizations who already focus on these specific areas and provide them with the necessary tools and resources. We should also maximize the efficiency of our existing infrastructure. High quality clinical care for survivors should be readily available. Community gatekeepers, including religious, traditional, women, and youth leaders, should play a key role. These groups are usually our first reporters and need to be educated and trained, specifically with regard to not acting in a manner that may destroy necessary evidence, support victims, and police reporting. They should also be trained to recognize and safely refer cases of sexual and gender-based violence. And women should be aware of the increased risk during times of crisis and where to access help.
Both men and women experience gender-based violence, but most of the cases that we see are adult females or children. Many people believe that gender-based violence is only seen in physical assault, but there are many different forms of abuse that can occur. These include economic abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological abuse. Psychological abuse is often more difficult to recognize and recover from. One of the most prevalent forms of this type of abuse is what we call gaslighting. So gaslighting is a form of manipulation where the perpetrator makes the victim start to question their own sanity. This is done by sowing seeds of doubt about their own sense of reality, thereby leading the victim into not being able to trust themselves or the validity of their perceptions pertaining to a specific incident. Instances can range from the denial by an abusive that previous abusive incidents took place, to belittling the individual's emotions and feelings, to the staging of bizarre events by the abuser with the intention of disorientating the victim. Many abusers will also threaten the victim with suicide if they threaten to leave. This is done in an effort to guilt them into staying within the abusive relationship. The perpetrator in such cases usually have a deep-seated need for control that could be due to a fear of abandonment. They also, in most cases, display sadistic tendencies towards others. The victims in these cases usually display strong traits of dependency that have been formed due to a significant amount of psychological abuse, like gaslighting. Psychologists are guided by the Bill of Rights and the Act of Domestic Violence in these cases, but there are also laws that are specific to our profession that we need to abide by. We are first and foremost guided to do no harm, and confidentiality is a very central point in terms of this practice. If a client discloses in therapy that they are a perpetrator that is currently victimizing another individual, we are not by law allowed to immediately report that. We are only allowed to report when they express an explicit plan that they will carry out towards an identified victim or themselves. It is important to remember that in therapy, our main idea is to build a therapeutic relationship where the individual can trust you. So if you do this reporting too early or without the individual's consent, that trust is broken and the therapy will then not be effective. We need to remember that South African statistics in comparison to worldwide are very high. In some cases, journalists have even referred to South Africa as the rape capital of the world. There are numerous reasons for this, including things like gender inequality, narratives about toxic masculinity in our culture, high rates of substance use that leads to disinhibition and violent behaviors, just to name a few. If we look at how gender-based violence is impacting individuals in South Africa specifically, we know that an estimated 16% of HIV infections in women could have been prevented if the woman was not in an abusive relationship. Men who have been raped have a long-term increased risk of acquiring HIV and are at risk of alcohol abuse, depression, and suicide. Women who have been raped are also at risk of unwanted pregnancy, HIV, and other sexually transmitted diseases. These diseases can have a long-term impact on the individual's psychological well-being. Specific measures that have been put in place during quarantine, such as school closures and restrictions to movements, have real-life implications for victims of gender-based violence. I definitely think there is a gap. With rape cases, for instance, a lot of the cases are not being reported. This can be due to different factors. One of the most important ones is fear on the part of the victim. In cases where the victim does report, they might have received very negative feedback from family members and friends. Oftentimes, victim blaming is something that comes to mind when we have this conversation. Victims also do not trust the police, and poorly trained police officers can cause things like secondary traumatization. The healthcare system as a whole is overburdened in our country as a result of staff shortages and mismanagement in the health sector. This leads to a lot of individuals who need care that do not receive it. So as a psychologist, I think the biggest contribution that we can make is to psychoeducate our communities about gender-based violence, how people get into these types of situations, why they stay, and how difficult it is for them to recover once they have left. We need to make sure that adequate support systems are put in place for individuals who experience gender-based violence. This includes shelters and also counseling services like Lifeline. A lot of women in particular who have managed to work through a gender-based violence situation want to really pay it forward afterwards. So that is why advocacy organizations are so important. At an individual level, if you see gender-based violence occurring, it is important to speak up. And it is important to speak to an expert within this field to get a plan on how to handle the situation in the most effective way.